I'd like to show you a classical attacking game from one of my chess heroes, Boris Spassky, the 10th world champion. And he was playing against Lajos Portisch in their candidates match in 1977. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Let's push forward to 100k. So last time, in the last video, I showed you a game between Magnus Carlsen and Timur Radjabov, where Carlsen played classical attacking strategy well, it wasn't a Spanish, but it turned into a position which looked very much like a Spanish. And it's quite clear that Magnus Carlsen knows his classics. He knows his typical strategy from the old masters, basically. And I want to show you one of these classics, Spassky against Portisch. I do like playing the Spanish with white. I like the King's Gambit, but the Spanish, well, that is such a great opening for white. It's so rich strategically. So this is the main line, and h3 is played to prevent the bishop pinning on g4. You can play d4 immediately, but h3 stops the bishop coming to g4. And now this is the so-called Breyer variation. It looks very mysterious to just move the knight backwards, but the knight redeploys here. Still defends the e-pawn, but now the c-pawn is free to advance to get counterplay on the queen side. And also this diagonal is now clear for the bishop to attack the pawn on e4. It has a very good reputation. But I have to say, I still like white's position very much. I like white's space advantage. And let's see what white can do with that. And yeah, I absolutely love this game. So this bishop is going to come around here to strengthen the king side. a4. So white just reminds black that this pawn is sometimes a little vulnerable, and that provokes c5. And white closes with d5. This is the main line of the opening. The pressure after d5, there's no longer pressure on e4, but it does allow black to play c4, and then this knight finds a nice square on c5, and that does provide some counterplay. As I said, this is the main line of the open. This has been seen in hundreds and hundreds of games. Queen d2. Now, if you remember in the Carlsen-Radjabov game I showed you, Carlsen controlled this diagonal. Here it's a little bit different. King h7 played by Portisch to protect that pawn. And in fact, instead of king h7, h5 is actually currently the main line. But this is also reasonable. Knight h2. Right. We also saw this move in Carlsen-Radjabov. The knight steps back and prepares to advance the f-pawn to open up lines, open up the f-file, open up potentially this diagonal as well. Bishop g7. So that's in preparation potentially for this diagonal opening, and of course the bishop protects the knight. Rook f1. Exactly the same as Carlsen did, shifting the rook over before advancing that pawn. And here Portisch played pawn to h5. It's interesting, this game was played in 1977. In 1985, a few years later, Portisch arrived at exactly this position and instead played knight takes pawn. This was a game between Jan Timman, famous Dutch chess player, Jan Timman and Portisch, 1985, and actually Portisch ended up winning this game. He was an assiduous researcher, Portisch. A really hard worker at the game, a great strategic player. And yeah, he had done his research, came up with an improvement, and even managed to win this game. And that was fully 8 years after this game was played. There we go. Those are the good old days. Not 8 weeks or 8 days, but 8 years later he came up with an improvement, or had the opportunity to play it. But instead of knight takes, he played h5. Now, the point is that black is threatening pawn to h4. When the knight moves, then the e-pawn drops. So it's not possible to play f4 straight away. So Spassky played f3, supporting the e-pawn. Of course, black would like to push on. This didn't happen. And put the knight on h5. This looks very nice, looking at these squares. But actually, after knight g4, that covers f6. And now bishop g5 is a threat. And the h-pawn looks vulnerable. Portisch played queen e7. Bishop g5, that potentially is an annoying pin here. So the queen stepped back. Now Spassky was ready to advance with f4. Cracking open the f-file. And at the end of it is that pawn on f7. So the knight dropped back. Rook f1 doubles on the f-file, threatens rook takes f7, and knight e5. Just as in the Carlsen-Rajabov game, the knight reaches e5, which does give some stability. The knight's on a very fine square, protects the pawn on f7. And if the queens were off in this position, if black had security, then I would say black's position is pretty good, because these knights will provide counterplay. You know, suddenly the whole focus shifts to the queen side. But here the queens are on the board, the king is actually vulnerable, and Spassky started to attack. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes, and now a little shift. Queen e2, threatening to take. And once the king goes back, then the rook will come over, or potentially bishop f6. Well, I mean, this is basically winning. There's also potential for that knight to enter the game on g4. But this is difficult. How on earth does black defend this position? Portisch tried queen h8, but then rook h4 threatens a huge check with rook takes pawn. King g6. Can black get away with this? Well, no. Pawn is defended, but Spassky breaks open the position with bishop d1. And once again, I'm referring back to Carlsen against Rajabov. Bishop d1 was the final move of the game that cracked Rajabov's position. And here, okay, it's a slightly different position, but I was just amused thinking about this game, seeing that bishop d1 was kind of the key move also here as well. Basically, white is breaking through on h5. And there is no defense. So, well, let's start with king takes bishop. Now, there are several ways to win this. You can take here, you can play a rook f5 check. Queen f2 is the cleanest kill, threatening queen f5 and queen g3. And there isn't really a good defense after that. There's also f6. King hoping to just duck back here. But let's have a look at this. Once again, queen f2 is a really nice move. So threatening, well, basically to take here. There's also queen f5 check. So the king goes back. Check. I mean, there are lots of ways to win this position, but just have a look at this, because this is good fun. Bishop takes, hits the queen. Of course, this is winning now. Rook h7, and now here's a funny move: queen b6, and white attacks from this side of the board, and that is completely over. But I really like this shift suddenly to the other side of the board. When you've got a space advantage, which you often have in the Spanish, you can use this space to maneuver your pieces from one side to the other. That's really nice. Anyway, back to this position. White has just played bishop d1. f5 played, rook takes f5, rook f8, Portisch hoping to exchange pieces, but, well, Spassky just crashed in and played an endgame, because here the only way to avoid checkmate is to give up the bishop. So white wins back the material with, well, basically a three pawn advantage. Bishop here, if king takes rook, that's checkmate. So the game went king takes bishop, bishop takes knight, discovered check. King here, rook takes, king takes, bishop takes, king here, knight g4. So white is now, let me see, 4 pawns up after that kind of cascade of checks, captures, sacrifices. 4 pawns up, and the knight is threatened. This check is threatened, and actually with those 3 pieces white can deliver a checkmating attack. So brilliant game from Spassky. Incredible how Portisch's position just collapsed completely after knight takes h5. There's another brilliant game in this Breyer which springs to mind as well. Tal against Spassky. Spassky on the receiving end. Played in Tilburg in 1980. I would like to show that game some other time. Some would say that the Tal-Spassky game is even more brilliant than this. And, well, yeah, it certainly has something. But anyway, I wanted to show this one. I like Spassky very much, but I will get around to looking at Tal against Spassky another time. And it is remarkable seeing the similarities in these strategies. Okay, I think I've mentioned that enough now. So thanks for watching.